Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first night of River Falls Days. Tonight we have Dan Geister, who is going to discuss the first 50 years of River Falls as a city. This isn't River Falls from the very beginning. It's when the city became its own government and established fire, utilities, etc. So just a little clarify there. I just wanted to point out a couple events that we have coming up that are on the same sort of historical side. One is the story of Frederick James Currier. Frederick James Currier was born in River Falls in 1860, February 3rd of 1860, and he set off on an Alaskan adventure. So it's a story of finding gold in the far north. So that will be kind of a dramatic reenactment along with information about his life and what it was like in mining camps. And that's on August 2nd. That will be in person here. Coming up sooner than that, July 19th, Party in the Park. We are celebrating 125 years of Glen Park. So there'll be a party, free swimming, posters and postcards, and historic interpretive sign viewing. Oh, free cake. Should be fun. That's a all ages thing, good family stuff. And then you guys are getting a little sneak peek into a program or a service that is going to be provided by the Pierce County Historical Association and the City of River Falls Historic Preservation Commission, who are also the people who installed the exhibit that's behind us. Starting Monday, July 17th, you'll be able to register online. If you've been wondering how to start your ancestry search from the very beginning, this is like, 101 Ancestry 101. You can ask an expert. So you'll be able to sign up for time slots for that to get some tips on how to get that started. So that this Monday is when you can start signing up for those appointments, which will be on August 18th. Right now, I'm going to introduce Dan because he's got a lot of cool information to talk about, cool photos, and he probably needs as much time as possible. So, quick bio here. Dan Geister's family has been in Pierce County ever since 1854, when his third great-grandfather, Samuel Geister, came to Prescott. Dan himself was born in River Falls and grew up in Hudson, Roberts, and River Falls, graduating high school and the college in River Falls. Since 2015, he's worked in the Stillwater School District and the Mathnasium Tutoring Center there. In 2006, he got the local history bug when looking for a history of Beldenville and not finding one. No history of Beldenville. His father, Chuck Geister, was busy writing his memories of growing up there in the 1940s and 1950s at that time, which was published in 2007 as Lilies of My Valley. He decided to work on one of his own with the support of Pierce County Historical Association and Ursula Peterson. She edited his first book on local history, The History of Beldenville, in 2008. A second book was written with Pat Morey and published on the history of Ellsworth in 2013. Dan also got interested in River Falls history, at first just concentrating on Main Street, doing a lot of the research for the plaques that you'll notice along historic buildings, but then expanding into other areas of the city and beyond. This also includes interest in the genealogy of all Pierce County. He was on the Historic Preservation Commission of River Falls from 2009 to 2012. Currently active project he's working on is a history of Diamond Bluff with John Norquist and Pat Morey, among other people, with the 100th anniversary of the library inspiring him to get back into talking about River Falls. He decided to do a talk on the city's earlier history. And here tonight we have Dan Geister. Get all my notes out of the way.
Hello. I wasn't expecting this kind of crowd, but it's fine. It's great. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the history of River Falls. Sometimes I have to look at my notes because I can't remember everything in my head, even though sometimes people think I can. Um, and it is about talking about the period from 1885 to 1935. So a little quick background of stuff predating that. Does anybody in the audience know who the first settler of River Falls was? Yeah, Joel Foster, 1848. And then the Powell brothers set out the village in 1854. There was Charlie Cox, and he had flour mills, and all of that I'm not going to get into detail on because that's earlier than what I'm talking about. So we're going to get into 1885 and the mindset here. Still, it was a big flowering community at the time, and the population wasn't that big. If you look at the slide there, this is kind of shows the population as we go through the years. So here we're a little less than 2,000 in 1885, and then I believe it actually says it's 1728, and then we're up here in 1940. We're at 2,806, and this is the earliest sign I ever could find of a population. So in 1950, which is beyond where I'm talking about mostly, 3,451, and we're like 5 times bigger than that now. So that's quite a it's just a little increase actually within that 70 some years. Up here is the bird's eye view of River Falls. If you know anything about history of River Falls, this kind of what the town looked like in 1880, and there's the flour mills along here. None of this is too important for what we're talking about, but the train comes in here. You can kind of see where the east end of the town is. We'll look at another map on the next slide or next couple slides. So let's go to that. So these people, I wouldn't, if I didn't talk to these people, I wouldn't have be doing this local history stuff. So Ursula Peterson gave talks to the schools of River Falls for decades, and she also got me on the track, and she did a DVD. If you ever seen that, Kaleidoscope History upstairs. She was involved in restarting the Pierce County Historical Association in 1971. Her husband Ed was at the university for many decades since the 50s. Kirby Symes and Audrey Altman, sorry, Audrey Black, that's not spelled right, but that's fine. Audrey Altman and Kirby Symes, they were both on the Preservation Commission for years and also always shared their stories and were an inspiration. Jane Hoffman, who is here tonight, she also has the bug and gives talks to locals, as far as I know, still, especially kids. And my dad, he's like Alice said, wrote his memoirs, and that kind of got me going. Tim Erickson was the archivist at River Falls for many years, and he wrote a history of River Falls for his thesis, 1885 to 1910. So that had a lot of good additional stuff or places I could go for information. But the biggest place I ever go for information is the newspaper, which is now online for most of these years, which is really helpful. So here we have River Falls. The map here is from 1895. And you can kind of see the different wards of the city. There were 4 wards of the city when River Falls was originally put out as a city. You've got the first ward up here. That's everything in St. Croix County. So there's just a couple blocks of Union Street and then a couple blocks of North Main, and that's it. The third ward is everything on the west side of the Kinnickinnick. The second ward is all the way up through 6th Street or so. These weren't really that developed at that time in the early years here. And then everything south of Spring Street is the 4th ward. So not just beyond the South Fork, but above here along where the campus was there. This was all houses now. This is mostly businesses. Most of those houses are gone along Cascade and these associated streets there. And then if you notice south of the South Fork, the park isn't even put in there yet. That was cow pasture here. And then just a couple blocks, a block to the west of Main and a block to the east of Main. So why did they decide to become a city? So here's some of the things they said, actually. So you have to have a couple different things. It's better to unite them in local interests rather than govern themselves. Before 1885, River Falls was governed under the township of River Falls and the township of Troy. So they also needed to get in things like the town should be represented from the village, not just the county board from the township. So that's another reason. You need some police regulations. So they wanted a police department. They want to get less taxes. And it was in 2 counties. And also The village pays the town more, $2 for each one expended within the village limit. So in other words, it wasn't a great deal to be underneath the township government and of two different townships. So why not become a city? One person that was against the idea of becoming a city was Judge Foster. This is Joel Foster, who was the first settler of River Falls, and he was pretty prominent citizen in its early years, all the way up to this point. So he actually went down to Madison. Why would he do that? Well, about a quarter of his land at least was inside the city limits, so the taxation would change here. I'm assuming that's what his reasoning was. It doesn't mean that his family wasn't involved with the early city, because his daughter Eunice was one of the head of the park board when it first started, and his son Joel got involved with the city limit or the city government as an alderman, and so did his son Albert Foster. By the way, if you ever have any questions as what I'm talking about, you can raise your hand. That's no problem at all. So that is kind of what we're looking at. So we're going to look at where things at, who are some of the people, the players in the city of River Falls during this time. So we've got the first place they had city council meetings was in the top of this building. This is the Boxrud block. It's in the Boxrud block, it's called. This is still standing in River Falls. It's on the west side of Main, north of Veterans Park, a couple buildings down. I think a nail place is in this side, or is that might be the First National, but it's near that area. But this was Hagberg's years ago, if anybody knows what that was. So that's where the first city council meeting were meant, because this is where city clerk Alan Weld had his office, his lawyer's office up there. He was a lawyer in River Falls in 1869. Some of the other people there that were on the first city council, just to get an idea who was on the first city council, there was William Wadsworth. He was 67, a retired farmer. Sven Rosenquist, he was 68, retired saloon owner. He had a saloon downtown. Rasmus Jensen, he was the youngest. He was 37. He is a general store where the bowling alley was, or right now is like Bold Burgers, or used to be not that long ago. That's Rasmus Jensen's store. And then Leonard Stiles was a retired farmer from Troy, age 62. So a little bit about some of these people. We're going to meet some of the mayors as I go along here, and also a couple of the city clerks. There are 3 city clerks. I can't go into every alderman ever, or we'd be here all day. I'm going to go into a couple of the fire chiefs, a couple of the policemen, but we can't go into every little person here. But some of the, for sure, all the mayors, and then a few other city representatives. So the first mayor, Abraham Andrews, he was born in Maine in 1830, and he graduated from medical college in 1861. And he was the assistant surgeon of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry of the Iron Brigade. So he was at the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War. When he retired from the Army, so this is probably an 1860s photograph. This was a recent find somebody uploaded. That's a Civil War buff, the picture of Abraham Andrews. When he retired, he came to River Falls, and he was with George Fortune, and they owned the Junction Mill down by where the power plant is. It's starting in 1873. He retired from that in 1880. As far as I know, he wasn't a practicing doctor when he was in town. He was more interested in the milling in town. In 1878, he was elected state senator, and he was a regent of the normal school in the early years in 1877. And unfortunately here, he died during his first term of office, July 23, 1885. So the election was in April, and he was gone by July. Another person that died that first year was Joel Foster. Joel Foster didn't have to worry about the city too long, because he was actually killed that year by being gored by a bull on his farm south of town in 1885. The first city clerk was Alan Weld. Alan Weld was the son of Professor Alan Weld, too. I mean, he was a different Alan H. Weld. This is Alan P. Weld. He's born in 1839. He actually came to River Falls in 1859. His father was one of the people to get the normal school here, one of the main people behind that campaign. He actually read law at the office of H.C. Baker at Hudson in 1865. And then he also went to Albany Law School, graduated in 1867. In 1869, he actually was the lawyer in town. He was the first city clerk, but he also had other things going on because in 1895, he was appointed to be Pierce County judge to fill the term of Hans B. Warner. Hans B. Warner had resigned, so he actually was reelected as judge the same time as he was city clerk, and he stayed city clerk almost to his death in 1916. He was city clerk from when age 46 to 76 with just a couple of years exception. In 1871, he married Alice Powell. She's the daughter of Lyman Powell, who is back there on the display there. One of the three Powell brothers that started the town, and his mother was a sister to Horace and Lute Taylor. Horace and Lute Taylor started the River Falls Journal back in 1857. So that's Allen Weld. This is where Abraham Andrews lived, the first mayor, 104 South 3rd. And then Allen Weld lived at 107 South 3rd. 107 South 3rd, don't quote me on this, but in a couple different sources, it says that that's the first two-story house that was built in River Falls. So that dates back to the 1850s in when the Powells were there. Lyman Powell, as far as I know, lived there first. Here's a little about the early fire department and a couple other people that were in there. So here's where the fire department was. Here's Walnut Street. Here's Locust Street. And you can see the first place they had a fire building was right down here. Anybody know what would be in this area? A little interaction with the audience. What's just south of Walnut Street today? What business? Anybody know? On Main Street? Treasures from the Heart. This was a photo studio. This is the Kellogg Photo Studio. And the next building, this would be approximately where Enstead's Dairy Bar was years ago and a bunch of other things. And so this is where it says it has 1.5 stories. It's got a hose, 2 carts, and there's different people that ran that. And then one of the first successful, this is just talking about one of the first successful stopping of a fire. There was a dwelling house here of J.B. Kelly that they stopped the fire in 1886. Okay, and then if you look at the town expenses there, that's from the first year. The first year expenses, there was about $1,474 in street work for the city, lumber for bridges and sidewalks, $1,265. Salaries, the marshal, which is other words, that's the chief of police, got $385 that year. The clerk, Allen Weld, $150. The assessor, $69. So the total price for the city was $4,846. That's about $156,000 from this year. The first police marshal was Richard Bevins. I don't have a picture of him, but he's a traveling salesman, and he also was a justice of the peace later. He left River Falls after a while. William Armstrong there was also involved in milling. He was in River Falls for 56 years. He was a traveling salesman of the oil company in 1901 for the Pan American Oil. He married Fidela Carlton in 1871. He bought the Prairie Mill in 1894. And I thought I had a picture of the Prairie Mill, but maybe not. That's with Putnam. Okay. Here's some of the first city ordinances. These are all the ordinances that were formed in the first year of River Falls. There's 22 different ones. You can kind of read through them yourself. I'll just highlight a couple of them. So this was a big thing that the police would go after people for. There wasn't a ton to do with the police, but disorderly practices, gambling. There was an ill house of fame, if you know what that is, on East Cascade at some point. There was a thing about you can't yell too much in town. You can't loiter. You shouldn't fire guns in town. There's only the guy that owned the gun shop. He could do it. He had a special permit. Of course, you can't be drunk around town. You can't solicit, and you can't have beggars around town. And then a couple other things. You have to have a license for a slaughterhouse, a billiard house. Of course, for any place that sells liquor, dog licenses were needed. Traveling circuses need a license. You can't obstruct sidewalks. You cannot race your horse less than eight, even if it's less than 8 miles an hour. Do not race your horse around town. Do, um, you cannot have your cattle, horses, swine, or geese run at large around your neighborhood or your yard. So don't do that. And it's still, I think most of these are on the books, but I can't tell you for sure. You need a license for skating rinks. Establishment of a fire department is a big thing because there was lots of fires in early River Falls history. And I'll go back to that again later. Here's a couple other city council chambers before we had the city hall built. So for a brief time, Alan Weld was too busy to be clerk. So this is Amos Carroll here. He owned this entire block. This was called recently, I think it's still called this, but it's not on the building anymore, but it's called Benko Commercial Building or the Brackett Building. This is just north of Treasures of the Heart. This is Walnut Street, I believe. Yeah. And then this is this building was built in 1870, and then Carroll built this back part. They dealt in like farm implements and stuff. And when he was briefly city clerk, the city council chambers were in upstairs. Those are apartments today. That's 128 South Main. And then right here, the city council chambers from 1892 to 1913, when the city hall was built, is 101 South Main. The business in there today is Crankworks Bike Shop. So we'll go from there. Amos Carroll, just a little bit about him. He was born in 1837. He was the other clerk in the early years. He was a blacksmith. He moved to River Falls from Prescott. He was in the business in Prescott of ag dealership till 1879. He was the justice of the peace for 15 years. His brother James was a partner in this implement dealership. And then he built this back end here in 1890 on the building. He was married. She died young. They had 3 children of theirs that died in childhood, and there was one that lived, and that was Frank. He was a grocer in Minneapolis. He's buried at Greenwood Cemetery, Amos Carroll. So here is Richard Bevins. Richard Bevins is the first photographed one that I can find, at least, of marshal, the city marshal. He was the city marshal from 1896 to 1903. He was from ages 36 to 43. I lost my note on him. Just a second. Yeah, here he is. So he was born in Canada in 1860, Richard McKean. He was the River City, came to the U.S. in 1872, River Falls, 1884. He stayed around here. That was his main job. He was actually a janitor in town too. And when he was done with being a city marshal, shortly after, he moved to North Dakota, Botany, North Dakota. And then he also moved to Minneapolis, where he was a janitor. He died in 1937, and he's buried in an unmarked grave at Greenwood. His wife was Eunice Oakley. Oakley had a lime dealership. If you know, go down to Glen Park, those big lime kilns that you go along the path there. That's his daughter married this Richard McKean here. He had 9 children between 1886 and 1903. All were born in River Falls. I can't go through every marshal, so I'm going to just talk about a couple others later. But there were 23 different marshals or chief of police between 1885 and 1935. Here's some of the things. There's no police report in the River Falls Journal back then, so you can see kind of some of the things that he had to deal with. So this here is an attempted burglary at the Burheit store. That's the store that's just north of Veterans Park. So they didn't really, it looks like where the thieves were, but it doesn't seem like I could find out when he was caught. And then at one point, Marshall McKean, Fred Muckenhausen Jr., Fred Muckenhausen Sr. had a grocery store downtown, and he actually put a trigger to his head. You can read this later if you want. It says here, 4 inches of the marshal's head, and pulled the trigger. The pistol was 5 cartridges and one was empty, and that was the empty one. So he was lucky, but he was arrested, and it's very bad because his parents, who are among our oldest settlers, are broken up about this. So, and then there's just a couple other examples here. Somebody stealing a cutter, and I'm not going to read those other 2. I'm just going to go on because we have limited time. So that's like the earliest police activity. No police reports back then. You can get into that if you want yourself. Here's a big thing that the city got involved in early on. That was putting a lot of board sidewalks around town. So if you look at the board sidewalks down there, let's see, there were, where is that? Oh yeah, 790,000 feet of board sidewalks in River Falls Place between 1885 and 1900. This is just an example here. So there's board sidewalks here on Cascade. Here it's looking west. You can see that. You can see that the roads are all not paved. It's just dirt roads. Another thing they always had to deal with was, do we sprinkle the streets? Do we gravel the streets? Do we oil the streets? Because they're a mess in the summertime, especially, and wives would complain about that. This is Burheit's store. So this is where, or not Burheit's, this is Jensen's store. This is where the Bold's Burger is now. And I just thought this was a nice picture where it shows a board sidewalk here. Around 1900, 1901, they started putting in other sidewalks. So I'm just going to read a little bit about what their reasoning for that. They put in cement sidewalk. The dilapidated condition of many pieces of sidewalk is not an ordinance with anybody's desires. The condition is not peculiar. It is an incident to the system of wooden sidewalks. The necessity for their frequent renewal makes the system expensive, but when the system is persisted in, frequent renewals are demanded. The condition of the sidewalks and the defects as to the people are to have the walks put in good condition. They want funds is the only thing that is lacking. So there was no funds really to put in cement sidewalks, and it wasn't that popular in smaller cities like this at the time. The sidewalks were renewed where the demand exists. The funds are withcoming. Many cities are making a durable sidewalk of cement in the west where frost do not derange it by lifting it at his right. A trench is dug the proper width and 9 inches deep, which is filled with broken stone, covered with sand on top of a 2-inch layer of cement. 1 part Portland cement to live of sand, and this is covered with a layer of cement about 1 inch thick. Portland cement and sand. So they put a little example on this front of J.J. Langdon's, and this would be in the front of Dr. Mack's studio. That was like the first place there was any cement sidewalk put in 1900. And now in 1901, they established the fact that if you wanted a cement sidewalk, whether you're in the business district or you're just by your house, you would go to the city council, and the city council, even into the 30s and probably beyond, you would go and ask for the sidewalk to be put in. Thing is, if you want it on your block, you have to agree with your neighbors, and you have to pay half the expense for it. So that's sidewalks. This is a little bit of a budget in 1900. Yeah, let's see right here. There's pauper aid started in 1900. There's a fire department is about $272. Street department oiling the streets cost about $100. Gas supply, I'll talk about that in a little bit. $1,000 to do like lumbered sidewalks. Cement sidewalks only $40. That's the one by Doc Mack's office. And then $121 for park, which is really small. The park was kind of very small at the time. It just started. I'll talk about that in a little bit. The lighting department engineers $275. The power plant was just put in 1900. $522 for labor that, and then the total was about $11,000. Or wait a minute, sorry, $18,560. It's about $672,000 in today's money. Here's some more of the mayors of town. So our second mayor, when Mr. Andrews died, was John Putnam. He was 48 years old when he put into the mayor's office, and he stayed 48 because he was only a mayor for half a year. But they had city elections every year at the time, and he was born in Brooklyn, Connecticut. He married Catherine Lovell in 1859. He moved to a large farm in Troy Township. He had 7 children there between 1859 and 1883. He lived at that farm until 1874. Then he purchased the Prairie Mill. The Prairie Mill is this building right here. That's not the same building that still exists there now, but this building was there many, many years till it burned, and that's also part of my talk. So that's one of the major mills in town. 1891, he moved out west to California, and then California, He was part of the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., or related to Washington, D.C. when he was in California. In 1894, he was the Chinese inspector of the District of Los Angeles, whatever that means. I'm not 100% sure. Did he have to inspect anybody who came from China there? I don't know what that means exactly, but that's what it is. Our third mayor was Jesse Thayer. Jesse Thayer right there. He was born in 1845 in Janesville, Wisconsin. This would have been before the state existed, actually. After serving in the Civil War, he was in Milton graduate of college in 1870. 1870 to 1875, principal of the Menominee schools. And he was conductor of Teachers Institutes and the first math teacher at the River Falls College in 1875 to 1886. He was a Republican. He became state assemblyman in 1885. He became mayor in 1886, but he also was elected that same year as the state superintendent of public instruction. So he had a lot of business on his plate, and then during that full year, he attended 2 city council meetings, which was meeting every other week. So he was kind of an absent mayor. He was reelected for state superintendent of public instruction in 1888. He actually was one of those that attempt to force the compulsory school law. Anybody have a guess what that might be? Compulsory school law. You had to go to school. Everybody at a certain age had to go to school. He led to the passage of the Bennett Law of 1889. That meant that at schools, the instruction had to be in the English language. In 1891, when he left that state superintendent, he moved to California, and he left his wife and daughter. His wife lived here with his daughter. His daughter was Stella Thayer. Stella Thayer owned a photo studio after Kellogg did in 1902 to show she got married in 1906. But he moved out to California by himself in 1891, where they lived in town. This is South Hall here. This is a street that would be kind of South 4th Street, but it doesn't really exist like that. But it's near where the college is. If you know where Hawthorne Hall used to sit, it would be kind of in front of that, a little north of that. That's this building here. This is a picture from the 20s, and then the Hawthorne Hall would be sit back here. This building burned down, though, in 1926. So that's the only picture I could find of it. And then, yeah. So that's Thayer. The next mayor was Edward Ballard. He was mayor during his entire 50s, and he was mayor for quite a number of years. If you look at that, from age 50 to 59 with a little interruption. He lived on 4th Street, 402. I mean, it's not 4th Street, 2nd Street, 402 North 2nd. I believe that's the same house as what was there then. He was a doctor in River Falls. He was born in Freiburg, Maine. Married his first cousin, Martha Andrews. He was a regent of the normal school. He had 2 children, Lizzie, born in 1866, and George, born in 1876. And he was a doctor until he passed away in 1898. But he was mayor close to that, but 1896 there. Next 2 mayors I don't have pictures of. I'll just briefly mention them. So Perrin here, he was 63 when he became mayor. He was mayor just 1 year. He lived at 142 Cascade. I don't think that building exists anymore. I don't have a picture of it. He came to Kinnickinnick Township very, very early, 1851. He married Julia Loring, 1858. Lorings were related to Bill Nye, if you ever heard of him, if you go along Kinnickinnick and go, this is a signpost in between, he was a humorist and kind of world famous, Bill Nye. Not Bill Nye the science guy, not that guy. But he married one of the Lorings, and in 1875 to 79, he was the county clerk of St. Croix County. 1883, he retired, and then he was mayor in 1888 to 1889. He moved to his sons in 1889, who was a doctor in Star Prairie. He also had a son in Superior that was a lawyer, Frank. There was the judge in Superior was Solon. Frank was the lawyer, and he was editor of papers, including the start of the Christian Science Monitor, his son was. And then Henry, who was the doctor in Star Prairie, and Mabel. He died in 1907, age 82. Fred Brackett, I don't have a picture of him either. Brackett came to the family of River Falls in 1854. He was an only child. He lived in Kentucky in the 1870s. He married Betsy Philbrick. He partnered with his father, Philo Brackett. They had a harness business downtown and invested in real estate. He also lived in Richmond, Virginia, St. Paul, in LA, California. He died in 1916, and I believe his grave is also unmarked at Greenwood Cemetery. Okay, so what do we want to do after we get some board sidewalks around River Falls? We need some lights. We don't have much lights. We have these kerosene lamps, and how else do we light things? Not very well. So we found out we can use some gas to light the Main Street. So on South Main, this would be approximately where Family Fresh is now, somewhere in that complex, the old Riverside Square Mall. This building would have stood, but this is from 1891. It shows the gas works here building. This was built specially for it in 1891. How did this come to be? Well, there was the earliest commercial club. That was Niles Hogan. He was the senator out of this area. Rasmus Jensen, that was the guy, one of the store owners. Fred Burheit, and then Jesse or Thayer. This guy. This is a different Thayer. They're not related to that Mayor Thayer. They got going the commercial club, and they got gas lighting in down and up and down Main Street. There were 5 street longs along Main Street that year in 1891. The way it was talked about that August, it was brilliantly illuminated, and the lamps vied with the moon for supremacy. So there was a 1,700 foot engine put into this building to help run this gas works from Springfield, Ohio. Don't ask me how they got it there, I suppose by railroad and then horses. Adrian, Michigan was one of the first places, and here to do this gas system in 1891. It was far superior to kerosene lighting and cheaper than coal gas. How it worked was the gas was forced through the sealed tanks by a pump, and you notice the name of the company is Acme. So if you know that from one of the tunes, it's also came from somewhere. So Acme. The top had an air inlet with oil inlet at the bottom. The area above the plate filled with charcoal and soaked in oil, fed through the bottom of the tank. The air put in the oil drenched the charcoal. The action of the pump forced it into the next tank through the connecting pipe. By the time the air left the last tank, it was a gas. Then it was pumped to service lamps at the other end. As we were like I said, one of the first cities to adopt this at a general scale. So there were 12 businesses lit by that addition of the 5 lights. I have no pictures of the 5 lights, but inside here, this is the Phoenix Drugstore. Anybody know what why would you call something the Phoenix Drugstore? Any ideas? Come back to life. Yes, very good. The Phoenix Drugstore was at the location now where Freeman Drug is. This area had burned down in 1890, and that wasn't the first time that area had burned down with a drugstore on it. In 1876, that whole area burned down too. So it rose from the ashes, and this was like a year-old building, and this is inside it at the time. It was Yoles and Avery, the Phoenix Drugstore, and here you can see the lights here on the top of it. That's kind of what Freeman's looked like back then, but it wasn't Freeman's yet because he was on the other side of the street. So, but there was a problem. So they did it on the general scale. What happens in the winter though? It's a problem. When the gas left the holding tank, the gas let most of its oil condense in the service pipes, decreasing the lights to barely anything. It started to smell. In fact, this was a quote. In fact, we cannot be seen without a lantern. So this is a problem in the wintertime. It stinked, and there was complaints about that. The people are supposedly getting used to it, though. I don't know. But so what they had to do the next year into that winter and the next spring is they found a different company. They're actually the Universal Gas Company. So they did continue with gas lighting all the way until 1902. There was a problem in River Falls. They had a little problem with the patent at the time. At one point, he was like the main employee of the city to do the gas lights. He had to go back to selling shoes. He was a shoe salesman, and he had to go back to selling shoes for a while, but it kind of limped along under this new program from 1892 to 1902 when it closed because of the replacement with electric lighting. So that's a little bit about the gas works, which I think is pretty interesting. I could get into it more, but that's what we're going to talk about today. Yep. Yeah. I think it was similar. The Universal Gas Company.
Dan,
didn't
Can you
I
repeat
ask
the
it-
question so they can hear it online also?
Do you remember what it was? You can repeat the
That's
question.
why I asked you. I'm going to hand the microphone off.
Is it really a good question if nobody remembers?
No, it's okay.
You mentioned the transition of gas companies,
Yeah.
and the problems with the earlier system in winter.
Yeah.
Did the underlying gas system change, i.e., to something like coal gas or town gas, which would hopefully be less temperature sensitive?
As far as I could tell, that seems to be what happened, because there was no problems with the condensation. As far as I can tell from those years, it wasn't really catching on like in the local area. Like, I mean, kind of what was initially established that first year was the system, and it didn't really expand much. That's my understanding of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank-
So yeah, the part of it was there was a panic with money in 1893, so the subscribers didn't quit. He was continued to get paid, William Thayer, till 1902. How am I doing on time? Oh boy, I'm really fast. I need to get moving. Okay, so this might be a little more than an hour than I think. So seventh mayor is George Chinnock. He was part of the Civil War. He was the mayor of River Falls from 1896 to 1899, 1900 to 1902. This is where he lived, 421 North 2nd Street. So that's right on the corner there, right across from St. Bridget's School. He was an implement dealer, and I'll talk about that when I get to a different slide. He actually, as a farmer in Troy Township, he had 6 children between 1866 and 1867, and he was president of the Farmers and Merchants State Bank, which was the predecessor kind of the state bank now, but it's not. It's a whole different issue. It went bankrupt during the Depression. And then James Dunn here, he was a millwright too. He's a starch maker. He worked at the Junction Mill. He lived at 421 Union. That's not standing anymore. And there's all the different years he was mayor. So he was mayor for a lot of different years there, from 1899 to 1918. He had 4 daughters and 1 son, married in 1869. He died in 1925, age 80. He was buried at Greenwood. Ninth mayor is Lund, Andrew Lund. You might have heard of Lund's Hardware if you're around River Falls long enough. It's been gone a number of years. We still have Lund's Flat Shop. So he was from Sweden, and he came to River Falls in 1873. It was kind of a similar area. He actually had his business on Maple Street before the Lund's. Has anybody heard of Lund's Hardware? Maybe. Okay. But yeah. So he partnered with a German carriage manufacturer by the Prairie Mill for 2 years, and he has his own spot, and then he bought the corner where Lund's is in 1885, and eventually that became a corporation in the 20s, and they sold tractors and they sold cars and all that kind of thing. And then he actually went back to Sweden in 1923, so he was mayor on the turn of the century. He lived, house still standing, is 127 South 4th Street. He married Pernella Youngren in 1890, but they had no children. 10th mayor is Ferris White. Ferris White is a lawyer. That's what the White Pathway is named after. He lived at 518 West Walnut Street. Ferris White was born in Prescott in 1862. He was a farmer at first, but he studied law. He was admitted to the bar in 1886. He was also the first city attorney. So in 1906, he formed a partnership in law with George Skogmo, downtown, White and Skogmo. He was a Democrat, and the only time he was involved in politics besides this was at the time he was the fire chief from 1897 to 1902. He had 3 children, Kenneth, Ruth, and Shirley. He was also part of the telephone company, and he also married Mary Foster, who was Joe Foster's daughter. And he died in 1940, age 77. A little bit about the waterworks here. I'm going to try to skip some of my notes because this is taking longer than I think. But the waterworks were established in 1894. And this is a picture what happened in 1894. We had one of the big floods of River Falls. And this is picture near Maple Street. So there used to be a bridge along here, a wooden bridge, and it was replaced by a wooden bridge that washed out. And then the bridge up at Cedar Street washed out. But they're also already establishing the waterworks. at that time. The first well, my understanding is, and somebody can correct me, was on the corner of Division and Main. But the well here that's called City Light and Power Station number 1 is near the power plant, and that was drilled in 1902. So I'm just going to read a little bit from what was in the well. It's 620 feet deep, this particular well that was built in 1902. It's still being used, and as is this reservoir, which was put in 1894, as is a couple of the fire hydrant. Let's see, where is the first fire hydrant? I have that written down. Anyway, for you geology not nerds like me, this is what they said about this particular well. So let's see here. It's 620 feet. 230 feet is lime rock, white sandstone, 40 feet hard lime rock, 10 feet sandstone, 80 feet green shale, 200 feet sandstone, 55 feet. So it's given from the record by the drillers, the rock at the site of the new well at the electric plant is different than the one at the pumping station less than a mile distant, especially in the thickness of the strata. We must remember that the ground at the site is 25 feet lower than at the pumping station, making the bottom of the well 150 feet below that of the first one drilled. There's a solid limestone stratum of 254 feet at the first well. At this new well, it is 230 feet thick. Then a stratum of 12 feet of green shale, 55 feet lime rock, and below this is green shale, 115 feet. The second artesian well only arrives from the first 400 feet deep is the same. Okay. We didn't have a water tower like this till the 1950s. There was another well. This would be the fourth well put in the sand pits of Milton Pritchett. This is west of, it's kind of near the sewer disposal plant. And at that time, they were also checking for water quality by the 20s. So here's a little bit about that. And I'm not going to read from that because that well could put out 500 gallons a minute at a time. This well here was only 200 gallons a minute. The consumption of the city water in 1921 was 381,000 gallons a day. So yeah, that's a little bit about the starting of water. I had one other thing I wanted to do, but I got to find it real quick. Okay. Yeah, 3rd and Pine Street has an original fire hydrant, and the main water main along Main Street and along 2nd Street are also original from 1894. And there's some other things. Now, what about, where do we put our garbage? What do we do with our garbage? And what do we do with our sewer? Well, this is kind of interesting because at that time, they really didn't deal with it that much. You kind of had to deal with getting rid of your garbage on your own. There was no garbage pickup or anything like that. So they did establish a city dump, and the city dump would be on the end of Foster Street, like where Bartosh Lane is today, but this is when it was a farm. This is in the late 30s. If you see this little gully, there's a pathway here when you go down to Glen Park to the lower dam. There's the lower dam. So it says, I motion voted that the following places, the city dumping ground on the road leading to Kaler's Slaughterhouse. Kaler's Slaughterhouse is about 300 feet south of there. There was a big cement slab. And even in the 30s and 40s, maybe beyond, I don't know, I never seen it. There was still the cement slab there for Kaler's Slaughterhouse. You have to dump in the ravine on the north side. J.J. Foster's Dam. This is Joel Foster's son, Joel Foster Jr. All persons required to dump in the ravine and not on the bank. In other words, you need to dump your garbage in the river. Do not dump it on the side because then it's just going to be a mess. As far as sewer goes, I didn't really study all that much, but there was private sewer systems, and there was some kind of sewer system where a lot of it would be dumped into the river. Behind Lunds is one place I heard a lot about that. I don't know all the details of that, so I'm not going to talk about it other than there was no real sewage disposal plant to the late 1950s that was proper. Here's a few more of the mayors. This is Victor Bailey. He also lived at that same house that Thayer lived in behind South Hall, 567 South 4th Street. He was born in Prescott in 1859. He studied at the University of Michigan, married Mary Currier. Mary Currier is the sister to this Currier that's having a talk about in August. He moved to River Falls in 1899, for his son Floyd to attend the normal school. He was a prohibitionist. He had a winter home in Petersburg, Virginia. He moved to Prescott in 1920 and Corvallis, Oregon in 1920. His wife Mary died, and he married her sister Lillian Currier in 1929. They had one child, or with his first marriage, named Floyd. So he moved out west. He's buried out in Oregon. The 12th mayor is Stiles. I thought he's kind of interesting. I don't have a picture of him other than this one when he was actually the postmaster. He lived at 300 North 2nd Street. Ferris White lived there too before him. He was a supervisor of Troy 10 years. He was the postmaster of River Falls 1916 to 21. He enrolled in the normal school as well. His sons did. He had 3 children between 1883 and 1888. He died in 1941, age 81. George Theodore Smith, I could probably spend a whole talk on. He's the next mayor here. He lived a lot of different places. He was a Danish immigrant. There's a whole thing about him back there in the back. He actually lived a lot of different places, but the time when he was mayor, he lived at 450 North 3rd Street. That's on the corner there near Division. And he, at the time he was mayor, he was president of the First National Bank. He moved out west. He retired. He married Maggie Rosenberg, who is the daughter of Frank Rosenberg, who was a restaurant and saloon owner downtown. She was born in the Czech Republic, came to the United States, and she's the daughter of Frank and Anna Rosenberg. So her mother was a Johnson, so Jansen Johnson, if you ever heard of that around town, that's that relatives. They had 12 children, I believe, George Theodore Smith, and they moved out west and to California in the 20s, and he's buried out west with his wife. The 14th mayor is Wesley Bonata. His father was one of the earliest doctors in town. He worked at the Junction Mill early. He had animals until 1923, some racing animals like horses. He took the Saturday Evening Post at home. There's an interview about him, so that's how I know that. The Country Gentleman. He likes Fibber, McGee, and Molly as a short radio program, if you ever heard of that. But he doesn't like movies, so he never went to the falls because movies hurt his eyes. He didn't like that. So that's at 216 West Cascade. He's a hunter and fisherman and head of the Rod and Gun Club, too. He kept books for Emil Karish, and he married Mae Astrom, but he had no children. He died in 1942, age 73. Here's the second fire station. So this is the corner of Maple and Main, northwest corner. Subway stands there today, but you can see here there was a couple fire things. They rented it from Chinnick, which was one of the mayors I talked about. This is looking north. That's the building here. This is the same building looking south. It looks smaller here than there, but it's just kind of a matter of perspective. But you can see the tower where the bell was for the fire, and they kept renting that until the city hall was built on that corner. That was later torn down, and then there was a Phillips 66 station, and then that was torn down, and then another Phillips 66 station, which was converted to Subway. And then this would be Doc Mac's place there around that time. Second fire chief is kind of interesting because he was barely a fire chief, but he was 25 when he was, and it was only like for 3 months. But he was Normal McGregor. He was born here, one of the earliest settlers, but he was also a producer, director, and actor in silent films. He left River Falls shortly after he was fire chief, and he toured around. He came back here in 1898. One other silent film star from here was Anna Dodge Hernandez. They both did a play here, and that was the last time he was here. But he did how many different films? 86 films, acted in 13. You can see there he had a famous autograph. So here's an example of a film, Mysterious Black Box. And I believe this is one he directed. Alice picked these photos out, so I don't know a ton about him. But is that the one he directed? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, fires. Just a little perspective on fires here. Here's the fourth fire chief. He had that slaughterhouse. He was a city assessor for 8 years. So Alonzo Cale, I think he's kind of interesting too. He eventually moves to Mountain Home, Idaho. The fires before 1900 and after 1900 from this perspective. So from 1885 to 1900, here's the kind of a perspective of how many there were and not. So this is in the city limits. There were 9 barn or stable fires before 1900, 5 between 1900 and 35. This is what I could find at least evidence of. Houses, 5 burned down that first 15 years, 8 in 35 years. So not a ton, but it still significant. Main Street fires. There were 12 major Main Street fires between 1885 and 1900. That could be a whole nother talk. 8 after 1900. And then there's a lot of other things that burned down at the time. An elevator, the creamery, a cheese factory, Junction Mills, the Junction Mill Cooper Sheds, a pickle factory, the normal school building, which is right here. So So we could have lost the college at this time because it was really hazy on that. And then even the public school burn in the 1926 here. The Congregational Church burn, Raymer Garage burn, tons of fires at the time. We happen to be on the anniversary of this fire. This fire happened on July 13th, 1916, 107 years ago to date. So I was going to just read a little bit about this. It was the heat of the season's hottest day, 93 in the shade. It was in considerable contrast to the conditions of the night of January 24, 1900, when the elevator across the street burned. The firemen were handicapped by sub-zero weather, which forced their clothes and armor at night. Tuesday's fire started at 3:30 p.m. It was first discovered by Nels Haderdahl, who found the flames. He's the owner at the time. Flames bursting out from an oil stove used for heating wheat. He attempted to smoke them out with a blanket, but in the dust and light timbers used, checked them. In a moment, the entire interior was enveloped by a swinging mass of smoke and flame. The alarm was sounded, and the entire building was ablaze. The firemen directed their efforts to saving the brand house and the elevator, which the success was phenomenal. The intense heat from the building, the wind fanned the flames onto the building so close at hand, and an inflammable material which they were working on. At one time, there were as many as 5 buildings on fire in the 2 blocks, all of the Prairie Mill structures, and flying embers set fire to the Ritchie residence far back on 2nd Street. No building except for the main building was damaged. In fact, all the others practically unmarred, even the brand house, with nothing but a wood partition in between. Prairie Mills were built in 1854. The present management is under Colton Whitcomb and Walter Sutherland. Walter Sutherland entered the firm a year ago. The estimate was $10,000, half covered by insurance. They planned to rebuild the mill, but they did not rebuild the mill. Somebody else did in 1934, and that's the building that stands there today. Another fire I want to talk about. Here's just a fire department photo. We can just look at. There we go. This is when the city hall was first built. I'm not going to go into who's who, but it's kind of a cool photo. So we put it in, right, Alice? There we go. Okay. So another fire I want to talk about real quick is this fire. This is the George Theodore Smith. He had this building built. The largest department store in River Falls at the turn of the century till about the early 30s was Stewart's Department Store. And it's this building on the corner. This building was built by George Theodore Smith. They earlier were in a building right north of Veterans Park. Stewart's wanted a new building, and George Theodore Smith helped finance it, the First National Bank. So they built this building here. That was built in October 1914, and the apartments in the spring. It was $38,000 to build this building. The fire started, though, the next winter, November 5th, 1915. Merchandise loss of $60,000. Here's the fighting the fire, and it talks about that back in the thing too. The first block north of Stewart's, they were going to move all their valuables. In other words, other on Main Street. One house also was broke while in use. Ben Rosenberg, who was directing it through the water, had thought the water had been turned off and was surprised to find that it was holding the nozzle while the hose was spouting behind him. Warren Knowles and Manly Healy were smoke victims. The former was overcome while assisting the fire hose near the end, and the other was attempting to save things from his apartment upstairs. So they built a new building almost right away. George Theodore Smith financed it. So here they're starting to build it. And here is what the building is in the 20s. You can see Main Street is paved by then. And that stands today. What's in this building? Treasures from the Heart. Yay. Here's the first fire truck. This is about 1926 or so, 1926. So this is an early picture of the library too, and you can see the library sign there. This is George Patterson. He was fire chief from like 1931, I want to say, to 1959. Don't quote me on that. And then these guys are some of his assistants. I thought I had this ID, and I do, but I couldn't find it, so I can't tell you who these other guys are because I lost that somewhere. City Hall was built in 1913. Kircher Brothers in Hudson built it. They built it for $9,200. It's said here on Elm Street. This is the alley on Elm Street. This would be where, is that Shooters now? I think that's called Shooters. Is that right? Anyway, Shooters Bar on Elm Street and the Tremont Building. I'm not a bar person, so I don't know. But down here, this is where the fire hall is today, and then along Elm Street. So this was built. They had put a fire tower in. Kirshner Brothers also built the Carnegie Library in Hudson and the City Hall in Hudson in 1927, a little bit later. There was a livery stable at that site till 1912, so there was no room to put it, but then the city bought it. It is time, so if you really need to go, I do have more, but it has been an hour, so if you really, it's up to you. But I'm going to keep going. This shows City Hall with the city, hotel that's kind of perspective, and there's a library building. Fred Williams here, city clerk. He was city clerk for a long, long time. He was city clerk from 1915 when Allen Weld died to 1948. He was born in Kinnickinnick in 1867. He kept books for 25 years. He was street commissioner too and alderman. He moved to town as his mother had to go to the high school. He taught school and a bookkeeper. He likes the radios and movies. So that's him. He married Laura Wolf, daughter of a local saloon person. If you never heard of Martin Wolf built where Glass Express is. This is a tangent, but I sometimes go on tangents. And he was the brother to Joseph Wolf, who did the Wolf Breweries in Stillwater. So speaking of liquor, let's go to the next slide. River Falls voted for temperance in 1888, 1908, 1915, and through 33. 15 through 20 wasn't required, but of course, what happened in 1920? Anybody? Prohibition, so they had to do it. But River Falls had it a lot longer. This is a big deal, I think, even in these early years. In 1888, they were getting $2,700 from the licenses. They were charging $200 a piece, $200 to $300, depending how you sold your liquor, a piece for the license. So they lost that revenue in these years of the dry years. But basically, they kept serving alcohol anyway, and they were fined. They fined back and forth, basically. And then the next year, the dries were voted out of city council and they got back wet, in other words, in 1889. But the temperance movement was still around. There was plenty of ladies and gentlemen, really, that were pro no license in River Falls. So that's why it came back in 1908 and then 1915, and then stayed that way through Prohibition. When the liquor licenses came back, they came back to a lot cheaper, $25 in 1933 and 10 for off sale. There were 10 licenses. I don't know if these will ring any bells because some of these lasted beyond the 30s, but the Corner Cafe, Leonard Collins Recreation Parlor, that's Bud's Lanes, OA Ocean's Place, that's basically where, what is that? Now I'm lost the train of thought. Mel's? Yes, Mel's. That's where that is. That's what this picture is, actually. Temple Lunch Cafe, Roll Waters Pool Hall, Wooden Shoe, Bowls Cafe, and the Hotel Gladstone. And also there was off sale at Dan O'Brien's, which is the table today. Let's move on to bridges. These bridges all were built in that time period, and they all built by the same company. We have the Cedar Street Bridge in 1908. That lasted till 1994 when the Division Street Bridge was on. It was at that time one of two steel arch bridges remaining, but we still tore it out because that's what we do in River Falls, get rid of things. Sorry, editorial comment. Anyway, then this one, I can't find what the bridge replaced. So this was in 1925. This was also Minneapolis Steel Company. That's the South Main Bridge. That's the old one that was torn out and a new one put in. 1912, they put in this bridge. This is the Maple Street original bridge from 1912. That was cement too. And then the Fall Street Bridge lasted quite a long time. That was from 1923 to 1992. They all cost between $10,000 and $20,000. Some of the other bridges that were built by this company is the Swinging Bridge, which we'll get to with the park. But there's a Winona Bridge, St. Mary's Aqueduct in Montana. There's a Sorley Memorial Bridge between North Dakota and Minnesota, Ortonville Arch Bridge in Minnesota, Granite Falls Suspension Bridge in Minnesota, and more. Now we have Glen Park, which was established. So we got Glen Park. There was 20 acres in Glen Park. This is the man that's responsible for getting Glen Park purchased by the city. The Powells, Oliver Powell, who platted out the land by the 1880s when the city was around, he was interested in sugar maple producing, and he actually got killed by that production process in 1888. But his sons had that land where Glen Park is. So John Barrett said we could do something with this cow pasture and make it a park. So they bought 20 acres, $20 a piece. It was kind of slow going. They built a pavilion there in 1900, and then in 1904, the first park board was around, and there were actually 3 women on it. I only have pictures of 2, but there was Hattie Powell Ensign here and Rosa Cheney. I could go into their background, but we're kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about everything with them, but that's very significant. I think that was the first year women were involved with anything with the city of River Falls. This Glen Park kitchen was built really early on, and that lasted till a tornado in 1953 went through Glen Park. This is called the Crow's Nest. I don't know exactly where that is, but you see this postcard all the time. That's in Glen Park. And then this was built by the city in 1912 to be supplement another building that was called the Glen Park Pavilion, but built by this John Barrett and Joel Foster Jr. in 1900. They used that for dances and orchestras and stuff like that. The snow fell on the roof of the pavilion, and they never fixed it. They just used the lumber and put it into the power plant in 1917. A lot of the Glen Park improvements were by the Women's Improvement League. It was a big city improvement. They also, one of the things that they established was bridges below to get into the park, 1904, but they would wash out from floods. So here it's showing the original bridge. Here it's showing what remains. I think this was a 1909 flood. That's all that remained of it. And then they'd rebuilt. Ursula always said there was like 5 different bridges there. I don't know. I haven't really studied that closely. But they built the swinging bridge here. And you can see here, this postcard view, there was still a dam there. That's the Cascade Mill. And if you go to the Glen Park thing next week, they can talk to you about that more. So there's the swinging bridge that was built in 1925 for $4,800. And then it was rehabilitated in the 1980s. Unfortunately, this Women's Improvement League, which was a postcard and a couple other places, none of these ladies are identified. So unless we spot them in another photo elsewhere, we don't know who's who. Glen Park Zoo. Who knew that? Raise of hands. Who heard of the Glen Park Zoo? So quite a few of you know about it. Okay, this is what I know about the Glen Park Zoo, and you can debate me if you want. We have foxes here. We have a bear here. A couple different bear pictures. These are pretty much all the pictures, maybe a couple others we can come up with of Glen Park Zoo. So the Glen Park Zoo was established in 1923 when the Rod and Gum purchased from Dr. Charles Dawson 2 bear cubs, Billy and Betty. The park commissioner, Ernest Buck, put them into a pen. So the pen in that photo had concrete walls. It had tubs in it, and the front is a bathtub shaped in the floor. And 2 tree trunks were installed for them to climb. They were kind of cement, I think. I don't know. I can't really tell from the picture. The whole pen is enclosed with wire netting. So we have the bear pens there. What happened there? Then they followed later that summer. Cesar Spilkey put in deers, badgers, coyotes, porcupines, pines, fox, and lynx. 6 tame deer were put in from Bayfield County Farm, where the woman who had kept them as pets. 5 acres were enclosed for the deers as you go down the wild. They also had owls at one time, pheasants, raccoon, into the zoo that fall. There was even talk of getting a buffalo from Yellowstone. Joseph Konachek was in charge of the animals, the zookeeper for most of the years. What happened though is it was kind of a zoo of attrition because the raccoon died or escaped in 26. They don't know exactly what happened. Billy the bear died in April 1927 of overheating. Just a couple of weeks later, Betty died. She was poisoned. The hides were put up on auction at Freeman Drugstore. and then you could get them there to purchase new cubs. There were new bear cubs purchased. In 1934, dogs broke in and killed the deer. We had a bad flood in 1934. There were some animals there at that time, and even a bear, because I want to read a little bit from that. But by 1935, the zoo was done for. I can tell that from the city records. You can look in there, and there's always a line. They were paying so much for feed. So the most they paid for feed was in 1930, but by 1933 they had $120 for feed and only $24 from the elevator to feed the deer. I'm assuming in 1934. So it wrecked the cages of the deers, and many left their pens. The pens were donated to the Isaac Walton League, and then a lot of everything else either was sold or gotten rid of. So this is another little excerpt. Thanks for sticking with me. I didn't time this, like I said, so it's kind of longer than I thought. In 1933, there were still penned animals in the park. Most of the smaller animals, such as fox, badger, rabbits, goats, and chickens, were located where the swimming pool is. Just west of that, in the ravine leading to the river bottom, so you see a large pen containing deer. And just outside the deer pen, there were 3 large, well-made cages with bears in them. I will never forget a park celebration July 4th that year when the park was filled. Many of us were watching the bears. People could stand on the hillside, and this is by a man named George Foss, by the way. People could stand on the hillside and look down to observe the bears through the wire top of their cages. Each cage had a climbing post made from a large tree for the bears to climb on. When we were all watching, Donnie DeMilling, age about 10, crawled out on the top of a wire to throw some food to a bear. He taunted the bear to climb up on the tree to get it, and when the bear came up to the tree, he reached through the wire and clawed Danny, so he was hurt and bleeding. That year, the bears were removed from the park and allowed, never replaced. As for the deer, they simply opened the pens and allowed them to escape downriver. Well, the pens were also wrecked by the flood. The deer had become accustomed being cared for and fed by continuing around the park. The following the 4th of July, when firecrackers go off, a couple of the scared deer followed their former taker, Wilbur Rupert, very closely all day for protection. In time, they all returned to the wild. The bear cages remained for a number of years before they were removed and the gully filled in. While those cages were still there, kids played in them. Each cage had a concrete den built back in the hillside. They were about 6 by 6 and 4 feet high. These places made good places to try out cigarettes. So there's another story about the zoo, but because of time, I'm not going to read it. About his brother Norman Foss. That's in Kinnickinnick years. You can read that in there. About a boy who got hurt by a bear and went to school. The teacher said he didn't believe him that he got wrecked by the bear, and that was around the same time. Okay, this Main Street was paved from Maple to Locust Street in 1920, and that was called the Great White Way, and it's quite expensive at the time. That was in 1920. There was 20,000 people in the city supposedly at the time. There was a concert on the band. There was a talk by Senator Wilcox, raises, a ball game, pavement dance with 3,000 people. I mean, it was coming and going. By 1935, only Division to Cascade was paved. Just to give an idea, the paving from, say, Prescott to Ellsworth was done by then. The paving from here to Hudson was done by then. But once you get to the cities and villages, barely anything was paved, just the main drag, and so they were still oiling and watering the streets. The photo here is them replacing some sidewalk. This is Peter Bellum, is the boy there. He's the youngest person in this photo. He was born in 1896, so I think this was about 1910. That's Harry Luberg. That's Audrey Alton's grandfather, if you knew Audrey Alton. Frank Luberg, that's her dad, and then Carl Parsons. This is mixing and pouring concrete for a sidewalk corner at Spruce and Spring. That house no longer exists that we see in the photo. Luberg Construction Company built the Masonic Temple, Lutheran Church, Episcopal Church, worked on North Hall, the Industrial Arts Building on campus. So that's a little bit about that. More paving. Power plant. Ernest Buck, I think, is a little interesting character, so I'll tell you a little about him. He actually built the 4th electrical power plant in the state. That was in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, and then he went to Charles City, Iowa. He married there. Then he installed plants at Hampton, Iowa, Osage, Iowa, Baraboo, Lodi, Whitehall, Partyville, Wisconsin, And then he came here in 1902, and he was here all the way to the 50s. He was the manager till 1937, lived at 217 Elm Street. Um, he actually, let's see here. He does not care for the radio, but he likes movies. He likes Lionel Barrymore, Clark Gable, and Will Rogers movies. He likes beefsteak for dinner, which was turned down at O'Brien's Cafe, and pumpkin pie. So yeah. So this was built in 1900, started in 1900. Luberg said in charge of that too, and on behalf of the city. And this is kind of what it looked like. Then 1900 to 1904. Then we go here. This is in the 20s. So this big engine, this is a 400 kilowatt diesel engine. By the way, hydroelectricity was first put in anywhere in the United States was in Oshkosh in 1886. So this is relatively early. This is 1900, 1902. The dam was raised. We'll look at the dams later, actually. But here's the power plant from the side in the 50s. So this part was put on in the 20s, so you could put this diesel engine in. And that was a 400 kilowatt diesel engine. The hydroelectric didn't quite cut it just for all the power anymore. We had to have more than just the hydroelectric to power the city of River Falls. Here's a little bit of the dams. It was first a wooden structured dam, and then in 1920, the cement structured dam was put in. This was the Powell Dam, the lower dam, which was wrecked recently. This building was there till 1934 flood, but this was put in to get a little more power in 1903. It never gave as much power as the other dam. Here's the last two mayors. You're probably thinking, oh my gosh, yay. But yeah, so these are the last couple mayors. Here's Mayor 15. He was in his 50s when he was mayor, 1928 to 34. He lived at the Gladstone Hotel because he had charge of the Gladstone Hotel. This is a little early picture, but I love this picture with the bike and stuff. This is Charles McKinnon, and that's you might recognize this building on South Main, south of the theater. He was born 1877 near Roberts. His father was the pioneer car dealer in St. Croix County and Hudson and Roberts and Hudson. He came to River Falls. He was involved for 20 years with the Gladstone mayor. He also was involved with when the swimming pool was started. The sewer system was somewhat started then, and the city hospital, which is another whole talk. I'm not going to talk about that. And then the Ideal Cafe, which is now the Table, from 1923 to 28. And then the Gladstone from 23 to 58 when it was changed to the Hotel Walvern by Freddie Gerberding, I believe that's how you say it. He had 3 children, Helen, Robert, and Bernice, married Vera Whitcomb, who was her father was owner of the Prairie Mill when that burned in that fire I talked about, the anniversary. Les Kay here, you might have heard of, you maybe not have heard of, but anyway, he lived at 420 Spring Street. He had an ice business. This is on the North Pond. This is this ice house. This was around until 1948. Of course, that burned too. But here that you can see they're taking ice out of there. He was born in 1888 in Martel. He bought the ice business from John Bowles in 1919. He bought a locker plant, which was there, which is now a bar on West Walnut. And that was there as a freezer locker plant until 1960. He was the first mayor that graduated River Falls High School in 1910. He married Helen Egan and has had 5 children. Okay, police activity. So there's a couple more police stories, if you bear with me. I hope you can. And this is one that I thought was interesting. So there was, like I say, 30-some police chiefs. This is Roy Hyatt, and he was kidnapped. Citizens pursue. The St. Paul police get the bandits. So this is what happened. This is his testimony. So this isn't, he had hours of 8 to 6 in the morning, January 16th, 1928. And this is from his point of view from a court testimony. I had my lunch at 1. At 1:30, I came out in the street and talked to the chief a few minutes, fire chief, he means. And it was snowing a little. I went back to Maine on my way, and I noticed a red light on. The red light is for the purpose of notifying us if we're wanted for something. I talked to Driscoll, the fire chief. Take me with your car up to 2nd Street, and we will see what's going on. We went and got in and drove to the lumberyard. There was a Chevrolet truck standing there. We looked it over. Nobody in it, and says, whoever this may want something are on the lumberyards. I go to South Elm Street and stood on the corner of the Old City Hotel. Seen there 3 fellows coming up from the south. The 3 swung right to me and put a gun to my stomach and says, hands up. and the other one too kept closer to the right. I threw up my hands and I pulled my gun. The gun was taken from me instantly. The fellow said, "Turn around and walk down the street." They see the Ford Roadster. He says, "Who's in that car?" I said, "I don't know." He says, "Probably some of your people." Not that I know of. Every time he would poke the gun in my back and say, "Keep still." He kept me walking north to Maple and then said, "Turn and go down here." He turned and went down West Maple Street till we get to the post office. By that time, the car had got ahead and said, "Turn around, go back. Hurry along too." So I did. They took me down back to the truck. He forced me to get in the side and down to the bottom. We drove north along the town and went to Prescott about 5 o'clock. Don't stop for nobody in this town, no matter how many. We'll have to stop on the bridge, but no stop for nobody else. So there's a toll bridge at Prescott at the time. They kept going, paid the toll, got in the outskirts of St. Paul. They met up with the gun squad. The gun squad came up to us, demanded a halt. There was no halt. They started shooting, and I think I shot a tire out. Then I got to Marina Avenue and turned. Right before that, I had been shot. They forced me to stand up. A block before, there were 3 guns total. I could sit up in the bottom of the truck. So these 3 men that captured him, it was a little different point of view from the newspaper's point of view. So I'm going to just talk about the end of that instead of the whole thing here. So the bandits had forced him to stop, hoping to use him as a shield for police bullets. Hyatt fell when a shot embedded in his side, and the bandits deserted the trucks and fled. The detectives rushed to the machine. There they found Hyatt, who is the Roy Hyatt. I don't have a picture of him, unfortunately. And Tom Plattner, St. Paul, lying in the machine, wounded. Plattner is the driver of the car. Examination of the truck disclosed that 22 bullets had been fired in the cab, none of them taking effect. These were bullets fired at the fleeing bandits by Dr. Kalk, who was a dentist in town, and Dodge, who is a hardware dealer. They chased him all the way to St. Paul, shot at the car. So that was that. And these 3 men, they got, I'm not going to name them here. I don't know if it names them here. But 2 of them got 2 to 3 years. The driver, I think, got 2 years. Another guy involved. But the main guy that put the gun in his back, he got 10 years. And when I looked him up a little bit, he was in prison in Waupun in 1930. And for this, I'm assuming, and then 1940s in prison at Stillwater. But he's buried up in St. Paul. So I don't know a ton about him after this happened. But yeah. So there was a court case and for that. Last thing I want to talk about is Dan Linehan. You might have heard of the name Linehan. He was a police chief, 33 to 51. And there's kind of an interesting little story here. River Falls, really, you didn't have to lock your doors. There wasn't tons of a need for a police report or anything like that during those years. There's some incidences here and there. But I'm going to read this incident, what happens with an example of what Dan Linehan had to deal with. Miss Eulilia Wisen, this is from Kenny Kinnick years, a public school teacher until her retirement in 1950, owned the boathouse on the east side of the upper pond. The kids used to call her ukulele. She sat on her back porch or on the flat slab concrete roof of her boathouse, and with a pair of binoculars kept on the eye on the boys swimming off the trestle. She would call the chief of police, Dan Linehan, and report that standards of public practice were being violated by nude swimmers. Something had to be done about it right away. Chief Linehan took the time investigating the situation, ostensibly because the press of other important business. When he finally got around to it, he would drive slowly around the Central Lumber Company sheds. Those are the sheds that Genevieve Rugo owns, the last railroad buildings there, kind of right on the west side, if you know what that is, near the trestle, and then honked the car horn several times and slammed the door loudly before starting the short walk to the trestle. At the sound of his horns, word went out, "Here comes the chief, get your clothes on." By the time they reached the spot, everyone was dressed. Chief Linehan could then report back to her that he had checked things out and found no nudity. It was a good thing, too, for several of the boys swimming there were his sons and nephews. So this is a picture of the trestle. If you never heard of the train there, that's kind of what it looked like. And this is the pond was quite big. Those are pictures of the pond. And I don't have a picture of the nude bathers. No, we don't need that. Just a couple more slides, I swear. Okay, so here, the library. The library was established in 1923. Here's Lucy Copley, the first librarian. Before the library, there actually was when the city hall was built, they called it the woman's restroom. The Improvement League really wanted this. So did the Tuesday Club. For 10 years earlier, 1913 to 23, there was a woman's restroom. Not only where you go to the bathroom, but you could just go there and they had a set of books, hundreds of books in this woman's restroom. In 1923, this became up for rent, and then eventually they bought it a couple of years later. This building right here, this was a photo studio for a longer time, Sanderson, right before that. And I don't even think the library is in here at this point, but it was close to it. So they remodeled this eventually, and that became the library. A little bit about Lucy Copley, the first librarian. She went to the normal school in the 1870s, and she taught school for a long time, 70s through the 90s, at Pierce Valley, schools like that, Clifton Hollow, Fargo, Ellsworth. She gave up teaching around 1900 to help her father. He was a farmer in Clifton. When he died, she moved to River Falls and first lived with her sister on South Main. She had boarders there and then bought her own home, which doesn't exist on Cascade, and also had boarders. She became a substitute as the matron of the public restroom in 1915 and became the permanent host of the ladies' restroom after Sarah Sanderson resigned in July 1917. She got $45 a month for doing this and the library, which is never mentioned. It's always the restroom she's getting paid for during all these years. And she never got a raise from the 1917 when she was the sub to 1939 when she retired. She died at age 72 in 1942. So that's a little bit about the first library. There were 3,000 some books already in the early 30s, and there was like 2,300 patrons of the River Falls Public Library already by the early 30s. Mary Levings Rosenberg, she was also on the park board and a library attendant. These are different people, women that were involved. I didn't know this was a separate slide, but here's different library attendants. Alice Hardy was also on the park board, Anna McDonald, Lenny Campbell, Edna Symes, Sarah Sanderson, and then finally Lucy Copley. These two were widows, and they were city treasurer. Netta Nelson Sandberg was elected in 1922. Julie Anderson Healy, 31, and they were city treasurers, and she was into the 40s at least. Park board. A little bit about Mary Leving. She was born in 1893. Her grandfather came to River Falls in the 1850s. There was a house there recently torn down where those apartments are growing in, or whatever that is, that large building that just looks ugly on South Main. She married Ben Rosenberg, 1916. She had 3 children. She worked on the park board in the early 1930s. She ran the Princess Theater with her husband, Ben. This was on east side of Main Street till 1927 when the Falls Theater opened. It kind of couldn't compete as well, even they both had silent movies. So that closed that year. She was upon the park board starting in 1929, and then after Ben died in 35, she married Harvey Wygant, who was a harness maker. You may or not have heard of him. They had a root beer stand on South Main. And then 1969, she married Louis Steens. This photo is courtesy of Charlotte Kuzlik, who is right there. So yeah. So there was, yeah, that's her aunt. So these are different other park boards. So there was Hattie Powell Ensign, Rosa Cheney, who I showed you earlier. Different women in early city. I want to end here with a couple of different things. So that we're going into the 30s, we have the Depression coming in. The American Legion built a hall, the first hall after World War I on 2nd Street. They kind of fell into hard times and actually sold this building. If you look at this building, it says the Legion Hall right on the top of it. And so they sold this to the city, and the city added on to this building where the fire hall now sits for an overall factory. And this was in 1930. This plant lasted into the recent times over on Clark Street. And here's a lot of the workers in the 30s. This is in 31. This is in 42 during the war. But they spent a lot of $100,000 estimated per year in River Falls from direct wages. The book value of the rent was $1,080. So they had 75 people employed. They would make overalls or garments, 2,500 garments, 80 machines in operation, 1,800 pairs of overall hauls a day were made at this plant. Let's see here. So every week you'd get about, maybe there was the whole overall, the payroll was $74 a week. You could get $2.14 or so per 8-hour day when you worked at this factory in the early 30s. Harry Lang started it in 1927. From 30 till the corporation went into receivership, it was in this building here. From 1927 to 38, it only turned a profit for 4 years, but all the wages from this was very beneficial for the city. 1938, it went into receivership. So they had 4 years of good, but then in the World War II, they got a lot more contracts, and it was booming business again for this Harry Lang. And eventually this building burned in 1950, and then Langware was built on the west side. Last thing, a little bit of budget highlights for 35. Where have we been? Where are we going? So this is 35. We have a city attorney that's at Ferris White. Mayor was getting $200 by this time. $1,075 for the city hall. Donations to the library were started in 29. That was $180 per year. Buying a wood lot, that was the city woods, 1,800. That was that year. There's 2 police chiefs by that time, 2 police officers total. That was 2160. One of them being Hyatt, who was the one who got shot. The other one being Dan Lanahan. If you see if I can, I don't know if I can point that out. That's only on my notes. I can't tell you where that is. But you can see the salary for the matron for the restroom, and there's nothing on here about the library. It's $546, $92 to do the electricity at the library. There was poor relief of $6,000. Of course, we're in the Depression. Rent of the dump, they're still using that dump, $50 a year to Bartosh. City Hospital, 1880. Again, I don't have time for that. There's a park caretaker, street commissioner, sprinkling still. They started stoma removal in the 20s and 30s, storm sewer, and that's about all I want to talk about with the 35. But the total is $76,924, which is a lot more. That's about $1,600,000 today. This is my last slide. This is an aerial view of River Falls. Here's the 1939. It's a little bit more or less the end of my period, but you can see the train still coming in here. You can see the upper mill pond. This lasted until the 1950s. You can still kind of tell where that is. That's all that was destroyed later. You can see the new areas of town since the beginning of the city are all these streets north of Division in St. Croix County up to Roosevelt Street. So it's just a couple blocks, but these are well-known neighborhoods now. And then you have over here, this is Residence Park. That was started in the 20s, kind of a professional people would be there, and people from the college would, and then these streets down here, Park Street was extended, of course, because the park was there. Church Street, this was still all farmland. You can see that here. Everything past Church Street to the south. That's it. I don't know. I didn't know it would take that long, but whatever.
That was great.
Okay. I'll take questions if there are any, or otherwise, I thank you very much for coming. And you have anything to say, Alice?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we can do questions formally, or we can kind of mingle. I guess if anyone, go ahead.
When are you going to write a River Falls?
The question is, okay, can you get the microphone to the audience?
My question was, when are you going to write a River Falls history book?
I don't know. I don't want to deal with modern times, to be honest. It's part of the problem. Maybe I could do like the first 150 years or something and stop in the 90s. So yeah, maybe someday. Right now I need to get my mindset back on Diamond Bluff. Any other formal questions? You can come up to Alice, or I can repeat them. Otherwise, we'll dismiss ourselves. Thank you for staying over a half an hour later tonight, because I didn't time myself. And yeah, wait. Oh.
I just wanted to say, I forgot to let you know there's also a display upstairs along the windows of some embroidery projects that some of our patrons did. I think about 34 tea towels. It was a kind of a retro project in celebration of the 100 years of the River Falls Public Library. So go ahead and check that out too. And Dan, thank you so much.
Okay, Very good. You can ask me informal questions.